to the magic of editing, it's back together already. Poof. I need a frame. What? I have frames. This is Eric from McCluskey Arms Company. Today we're going to be putting the P-09 back together after we did the optic cutting, the Glock irons forward cut, and the raptor cut. All right, we will start with the frame. So the first thing we need to put back in is the magazine release. The magazine release is going to have this spring and this plunger in it. Those go together, spring first, plunger second, like that. And then just push the plunger down in, like that. We're gonna put the retaining pin back down through the frame, like this, and you have to push the plunger in to slip the retaining pin past. This is an ambidextrous magazine release, so it'll go in both ways. Make sure to put it in the correct way for the person who brought it in. Right-handed people, the button goes on the left side of the gun. Slip the larger notch down into the frame. That notch, the smaller notch, is on this end. That goes up towards the top of the frame. That end goes down. I'm gonna slide this right down into this hole. And then we need to push that detent in from the side while pressing down on that. Once it starts, you can just push it down. It should end up nice and compact like that. And make sure it functions. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is put this detent spring back in the front metal housing. This spring is gonna go with the front leg. So it's gonna end up in this position inside so that this leg is down into that hole. And it'll go down into this slot right here, just like that. And then the beveled end of the pin goes into the gun. And then you can just tap that in. Should end up like that, where you can see the spring in this hole here. All right, now we're gonna put both metal housings back into the gun. So the front metal housing will go into the frame like that. And then the rear will go into the frame like that. All right, now we're gonna put those roll pins back in. The short one goes in the front. I always start them with the plastic side of my hammer. You can also start them with the brass side if you want. You start the roll pins with the plastic side so that the steel or brass side of your hammer doesn't dent the roll pin and deform it enough to mess up the plastic of the frame. You also want to set this roll pin in so that it's even on both sides. The long roll pin, it's the smaller of the two roll pins, so it's the smaller diameter. This one is the firing pin retaining pin. It's a little bit larger. This one is smaller and longer. This one will go in next. Get it going with the plastic side and finish it off with punch slightly smaller. Try and get it centered up in the frame. As I'm working on this pistol, the dirt and grime from the inside of the gun is getting on the outside of the gun. You can see it right there. When we're finished up, a little bit of simple green on a paper towel will take all that off. It's a lot easier than keeping your gloves or whatever you're wearing clean from the parts, because all these parts are going to be oily and greasy, and these tan frames love to get dirty. So the next thing we're going to put in is going to be the trigger and trigger return spring. The trigger return spring goes into the top of the trigger like that, and then this leg needs to be pulled up to go on top of the frame. I'll show that a little closer, but they'll take a needle nose pliers and hold on to the spring like that. I'll catch this leg on the frame of the gun and then insert the spring into something like that. Then you can hold it down while you get a starter pin punch in there. So before you put the trigger in, you're going to put the trigger bar on the trigger in that orientation. Little notches up. Slide the trigger down in the frame. Get the trigger lined up with the hole, and then put the trigger pin in, and then back it off to the left-hand side like this, and then we'll fit the trigger spring down in there. So you're gonna get the front leg of the trigger spring on there, and then flex the spring to get the back leg into the trigger pin spring hole, and then get it lined up so you can get the trigger pin through like that. So that's the final resting place of the trigger spring. This is the long leg. Short leg goes down into the hole in the trigger right there. Hopefully you can see that. So the next thing to go in is going to be the hammer. That's your hammer. If you have your hammer strut off, you can press that pin back in. Hammer strut goes in that orientation, so the curve is to the back. This guy goes in this orientation, like that. And when you move this, the reason you're moving it is because this cam on the bottom of it goes into that hole, or covers that hole, and rides in this notch on the hammer pin. So when you're putting the hammer pin through, this always has to be in that orientation. So this hammer is going to go down into the frame. So that boss right here on the hammer connector needs to be in front of, there's a slot that it needs to go in front of. And then make sure it's in the up position, and you can slide your hammer pin through. Make sure the notch in the hammer pin is on the right hand side of the gun. And then if you fold this guy down, it'll keep the pin from falling out. Make sure that pin is centered up. All right, next is going to be the Sear and the disconnector. The Sear spring and the Sear in. The Sear spring goes down into this hole right here. Like that. The spring here just rests down in that hole. The Sear will cover it right there. The bottom of the Sear. Bottom piece of the Sear here will contact that spring. So the Sear will set in like that. So now we can slide the Sear pin through. It's two different sizes. it goes in from the left to the right. So this is gonna end up on the right-hand side of the gun, and this is gonna end up on the left-hand side of the gun. The Sear, you have to hold it down just slightly to get the hole to line up. And then on the other side here, we need to get the disconnector assembly in there. That's the disconnector. And then it's got a bushing. This is the orientation that that bushing goes in. It can go in from either side, so make sure to get it in the right side. The disconnector is gonna slide down in the frame like this, and it's gonna end up right there. So we're gonna set that down, and you kind of have to work it in from the front. And you just line everything up and get that Sear pin through everything, and it'll look like this when it's in. Now we need to put in this spring right there, and then the ejector. So the ejector spring is this one, and the ejector is that one. When we put the spring under, it'll end up right there, and this piece here will, this notch right here will go into or under that Sear pin. Set the spring down in this hole right there, and then set the ejector down on the spring, push down and back, and that's gonna click into place, and it'll spring nicely up and down without falling out when it's in correctly. Now we need to put the decocker right-hand side in. That's pretty straightforward. We're just going to set it in any orientation that it can fit, which is going to be in that orientation. Set it in and twist it to be in the upright orientation. So when we put it all back together, it's going to want to stay in that orientation there. And you do need to put the right-hand side in first before you put the left-hand side in. Now, before we put the left-hand side in, we're gonna set this spring down into that roll pin right there. So the long leg of the spring sits into that roll pin. I usually use tweezers or needle nose pliers. Take it like that. So we're gonna set it down onto or into that roll pin down there, like this. It's gonna live like that for now. Now we're gonna take the right-hand side and just start it through to where you can get it through that spring. Now it needs to go through that spring, and then you have to tilt it back and pull this spring over until it's underneath that leg. You can get it under that decocker. Make sure that the left side decocker is in that position I showed you earlier. Rotate the right side down and push it in. And it should be all lined up to go in, like that. Make sure the decocker is spring loaded. It's all locked in, and you should be able to see that spring leg is all the way down here under that notch right there. We have assembled the frame, with the exception of the mainspring plunger, and the mainspring plunger pin. We are going to put the mainspring on like that. It does slide over the hammer strut. The mainspring plunger angle so that it matches the back of the grip. And just push the mainspring plunger in with your thumb and start the pin. pins in that plunger tube, plunger cap, spring cap, whatever it is flush. Need to put this spring down into this hole. Use a needle nose pliers. It goes in that orientation and set it down into that hole. Like that, and then just push it down and get it underneath the trigger bar. And that just keeps your trigger bar spring loaded up. That's an assembled frame. We're just gonna do the slide. I need an RMR. All right, so on ours, we have to put the RMR on first. You won't have to if yours is an RMR cut. Use this sealing plate. And the sealing plate is gonna give us something to cover that safety hole. Our RMR cuts are machined right to the top level, so we can just use this to cover it up again. That gets the optic as deep as possible. Put the battery in the optic. Drop it down on. Screws in. All right, now we can start putting our slide back together. First thing we're gonna do is put the firing pin block in, just like this. So that notch goes towards the middle, like that. And then we're going to slide the firing pin spring onto the firing pin. And then with the notches facing up, or I guess if we're putting the slide upside down, we're gonna face the notches down. So we're gonna face the notches straight down. And we're gonna slide them in while pushing the safety down. All right, now we have to hold the firing pin in just a little bit to get the firing pin roll pin back in. Start with that. And just push the firing pin in until you can see that hole is free of obstruction there. Drive that roll pin almost all the way in with an oversized punch so it doesn't slip off. And then find the correct sized punch to drive it the rest of the way in. And make sure that roll pin is centered. That's gonna hold our firing pin and everything in. Now we're gonna put the extractor in. The extractor spring and the extractor spring guide. In the gun, they're gonna go like that. So the first thing I do is set the spring guide in and the spring into the hole, like that. Then you're gonna hook this into the slide and set it down in like that. Now you line up the spring and the spring guide with the hole in the extractor, like that. You can just hold it in with your fingers. All right, you're gonna take the extractor pin and it goes down from, it goes up from the bottom. It should start nicely. And then you can tap it in. And once you get it into about there, then just start with a punch and tap it the rest of the way down. And and it just needs to be flush. All right. And we'll put the front sight in. We're going to be using Dawson sights. These are sized properly to co-witness with the optic, and they're sized properly to work with a CZ front sight and a Glock rear sight. These do have set screws in both, although this front set screw is the tiniest little set screw you ever did see. So make sure that that set screw is loosened out. You don't want it to be dragging on the slide the whole way. Set it in the dovetail like that, and then just tap it in with a plastic hammer. No need to use brass or aluminum on that. It's plastic hammer will do the trick, and it won't mess up your sights. Same thing if you're using the CZ factory sight. Just make sure the set screw is out, and tap it in with a plastic hammer. Right. And then the Glock sight, you're just going to put in the vise. They should be just tight enough to tap in, but they shouldn't be very tight. If you have a all black sight, the one with the serrations on it is going to be the one towards the shooter. Now we're going to screw that set screw on this one all the way down. And then we'll bore sight these as well, but for the sake of the video, we'll put it centered. Right now, put your barrel back in. Put your thread protector back on. Slide onto the frame back until the notches line up. Push that thing in. That's an assembled P-09. I think that's everything.